Hi, everybody. Welcome to the International Water Resources Association webinar on climate change and adaptive water management. I'm Scott McKenzie. I'm the moderator, and we have a great panel ready for you here today. And we are going to start in just 1 or 2 minutes. So I'll give you one last chance for a final cup of coffee or a final glass of water, glass of tea, depending on whatever hour it is for you. And we'll be back here in about 1 or 2 minutes. We'll be ready to go. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, everyone. We have a few new people joining us here today. This is the International Water Resources Association webinar on climate change and adaptive water management. We'll be getting started here in just 1 more minute. So if you have any last things you want to do before we get started, we'll be ready with you in just a minute. We have a great panel already. Okay, it's 4:02 here in the Central European Time Zone, so I think it's about time for us to get started with our webinar today. This is the International Water Resources Association webinar on climate change and adaptive water management. We have a great panel with you here for you here today. Includes Charlotte McAllister from the International Development Research Center in Canada, Alan Kane from the Development Workshop in Angola, Mustam Fadel from American University of Beirut, Oscar Mello, Pontificia University Católica in Chile, Veena Sirivan, Ashoka Trust for Research and Ecology in the Environment in India, and Kamal Vata, the Columbia Research Center in India as well. I'm really excited about this panel because I think this is definitely a record for the most geographically diverse panel we've had. So we are really thrilled to be able to bring a lot of different scholars and researchers and practitioners from literally all around the world to speak with you here today, and I'm really excited to be able to get these connections going. So we really appreciate the IDRC's help in planning this project and getting this going. Thank you so much for that work. As you know, this is a webinar hosted by the International Water Resources Association. The IWRA is an international network of researchers and practitioners who work on a multidisciplinary range of water resource issues. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization. We provide a global knowledge base to bridge disciplines and geographies, as we're doing here today, and connect professionals, students, individuals, corporations, and institutions, everyone who's concerned with the sustainable use of the world's water resources. So we're really happy to have you here today, and thank you for tuning in. We have such a great panel and practitioners, people from all these different NGOs and universities who all have so much experience working with and researching this webinar theme. As many of you know, the webinars are often based on the flagship special issues of our flagship publication, Water International, and this is no exception. This is a really great collaboration for us with this special issue because it connected us with the IDRC and showcases a lot of their work on water and climate change adaptation in developing countries. All these projects that we're going to hear about today work on measuring and building resilience and adaptation for some of the most vulnerable populations in the world, and particularly in hotspots such as Asia and Africa. So that's going to be really exciting here for us to hear from some of these projects today. And what we would do is to continue the discussion we start here in the next few minutes by going to our LinkedIn webpage afterwards, and we'll have in a day or two we'll have a short summary up, and you can feel free to contribute to our LinkedIn page and see if there's questions that you want to follow up on or debates you want to start. Please go there and use that as a forum to follow up and continue this. I should also remind you that all the publications that we're discussing here today, it's an all open access issue for us. So please feel free to go and read all of these articles, cite them in all your work, cite them in every article you write. I'm sure that all the authors will be pleased with that. So no, but please do go read them and take use of this, because IDRC was gracious enough to help make sure this was an open access issue. We really appreciate if you're able to make use of that. So I know a lot of you have tuned into some of our webinars before, but for those who are coming new, let's just kind of review today's format. What we're going to do is have each of our presenters give a short presentation, PowerPoint presentation, and then at the end of that, we'll have time for audience questions. You can see there on your GoToWebinar control panel on your screen, about halfway down is a box for questions. You can just go ahead and type your questions in there, and then I'll see them and relay them to the appropriate person when it's time for questions at the end of all the presentations. And we'll also make sure we're having a recording of this webinar, and that'll be on our YouTube channel and available on our webpage in a few days. And we'll also have the PowerPoints from all our presenters also up on our webpage in a few days. So those are popular questions and things that people are always asking. So they'll be on the internet, don't worry. They never disappear once they're on the internet. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn the floor over to our first presenter, Charlotte McAllister, who is at the IDRC, and she can tell you more about this project. So, Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. And you can see my screen?
I cannot.
Okay.
There you go. Now I can. Go and make that full screen, and we'll go to go.
I'm going to make that full screen. Exciting. You see full screen mode now?
Not quite. Give me 1 second there. Give it another click there, maybe.
Do you see my screen?
I see your screen just fine. Your PowerPoint is still kind of what would you call it? What we're just seeing, we're seeing the whole website or the whole program, not the actual full slides.
Okay.
It worked just fine when we practiced it.
Yeah, and it's in full screen mode now.
No.
I see it fine actually now.
Yeah.
I see the full presentation.
I see it fine as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
well then let's go for it. Maybe it's just on my side. Go for it, Charlotte.
Okay. So thanks very much, Scott. So as Scott said, I'm Charlotte McAllister from the Climate Change Program at IDRC. I was tasked some years ago with putting together, and as all of the participants today know, it was quite a monumental task bringing this all together. But finally it's there, which is fantastic. So I'll just quickly give a brief introduction to IDRC for those who are not familiar with the organization. So IDRC is part of Canada's Foreign Affairs and Development efforts, and basically we support Southern-led research into innovative and lasting local solutions to bring about positive change. The organization's been around for over 45 years now. Why do we support research in climate change? Well, as we're very well aware now, climate change and development are interconnected. Climate change impacts are most pronounced in the developing world, where resources are constrained and services are often limited or lacking. And in this case, the poor are often disproportionately affected because typically they're more exposed to climate-related shocks. IDRC started programming in climate change and water adaptation over 10 years ago, with a clear realization that climate change threatens any development gains that we can make, especially in the case of the livelihoods of the poor and most vulnerable. Aside from the climate change and water program, we've supported a number that have contributed directly to development and adaptation research, including programs in urban poverty and rural poverty and environment programs, a number of fellowship programs and Canadian partnerships, and of course the work supported by our agriculture and food security programs. Basically all of this research, and especially the work of the climate change and previously climate change and water program, have a multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research approach, and we try typically to breach the research and policy silos with this approach. So over the last 10 years, really, since around 2006, through joint research initiatives funded by the UK Department for International Development and the Government of Canada, we've supported 70 countries, around 70 countries in our 4 main target areas of programming, so Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in adaptation research. And this has produced more than, quantified at least at more than 280 adaptation options that have been identified and tested. More about this at the end. And over 1,000 researchers have been supported in more than 165 institutions, informing decision-making around the Global South. So the multidisciplinary programming of the climate change and water program includes a range of different themes, some of which are mentioned on this slide, but not all. These have been pretty much covered fairly well in the special issue of Water International. So in the special issue, we have 9 papers, 9 research papers from 9 different countries. The themes cover, well, it's actually very broad themes, including agriculture, low-cost technologies, community-based, urbanization and complex IWRM, also financial mechanisms, the impact of salinization from a household level to large cities, and also post-conflict water management. So really what we tried to do in this special issue is to bring together a kind of a sample of the sort of work that IDRC has been supporting in climate and water adaptation over the last decade. It was hard to do this simply because we have got a vast really of excellent research related specifically to water, but other themes. So selecting only 9 papers was not an easy task. We also received many excellent papers that were not 100% about water that didn't get published in the special issue, and a lot of that research has gone to other journals. Following our open data and our Creative Commons policies, all of the papers, as Scott mentioned, they're all open access, so please do share them as widely as possible. This is just illustrating that, as Scott also said, the geographic spread of his issue. You can see, that actually there are less from Latin America, but that doesn't reflect the amount of research that we have in Latin America. But you can see the spread of the geographic spread of the research here. So who's speaking today? Scott did mention this, but I'll to, well, very interesting topic on his work on water in Angola's coastal settlements. It's a project that I've followed over the years, and it's very interesting, as are all of the projects. Murtasim is actually going to speak to 2 papers that are in the special issue. This project did result in 2 publications in the special issue, but they're on slightly different themes. So he's going to talk about some of the technical aspects and then the socioeconomic aspects of saline intrusion. And Oscar's going to talk about the more financial theme on water option contracts in Chile. And then Vina's going to speak to some of the complex IWRA issues in urbanizing watersheds in India. And finally, Kamal is going to talk to us about low-cost water-saving technologies in India and Punjab. So as I said, the projects today, they're going to represent a small but very significant sample of our work. And I hope that you're going to enjoy the presentation. And finally, if you want to learn more about the kind of research that IDRC has supported in the water and adaptation sector over the years, you can take a look at our online catalog of adaptation options that you can see here. So, just want to say thank you, a sincere thanks to all the contributors to the special issue, including those that submitted papers that were not included, to the editorial board, especially James Nickham, to Scott for organizing this webinar, and of course also the staff at Taylor Francis. And thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. And last but not least, I also have to mention my fellow guest editor, Nidhi, who put in an unbelievable amount of work into the special issue. I don't think that we could have done it without her. And of course, the speakers. So back to you, Scott.
Well, thank you so much for that overview and discussion. I thought it was really helpful to understand, all the places and geographies that IDRC has been active over the years, and kind of seeing some of these long projects come to fruition. I mean, of course, they're always producing outputs, but to kind of see the terminus of several different projects kind of come together in these papers and special issue. I thought that was really meaningful and helpful. It was really good. I hope that everyone is able to access the special issue and share it and read it and enjoy it. So, and I think it's really great that this is open access. So, okay, our first presenter is Alan Kane at the Development Workshop in Angola. Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Scott, and thanks, Charlotte. Trying to see, can you get my presentation up?
There you I need you, the presenter. There you go.
Can you see the presentation? Okay.
Yep, just make that big. And
let me see.
I think it's at the no.
Just a moment. How do I get the?
We just practiced it, a few minutes ago. Just click on the presenter mode there, or on the podium mode, I believe it is called. No.
Sorry about that. Yes. Okay. There we go.
There we go. That looks good. Perfect. Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm presenting the research that we did with IDRC support over a number of years on informal water markets and community management in peri-urban Luanda. Angola is a post-conflict country. Luanda, the capital, is one of Africa's fastest growing cities with roughly 7% growth annually, and it's reached a population of around 7 million in the last year. During the conflict years, the informal economy grew and provided over 30, almost 40% of the employment for the country. And during these conflict years, the informal sector filled the gap, providing basic services like water and sanitation, but employment for a large part of the population. Water selling is probably the largest subsector of Angola's informal economy. And today, 15 years after the end of the war, the informal water market continues to meet a large demand that the state cannot satisfy, particularly for urban city dwellers. This is a projection over the last 20 years of the growth of the formal water economy, and we can still see that roughly a third of the population depends on the informal economy. The informal water market involves truck drivers drawing water from a nearby river. It's a costly, poor quality system because water is largely untreated, and the informal distribution system can spread waterborne diseases as well. But it's an extremely costly way of delivering water as compared to piping water. But an average family can spend 5% of their household expenditure on purchasing water, but the poorest households, 9 to 12%. The government sees informal suppliers as an enemy of their development plans. They see them as profiteers, of water marketers, water mafia exploiting the poor. But the informal economy still provides an important, filling the gap of services that the government can't supply. Though my organization, Development Workshop, has argued that rather than criminalizing the informal economy, the government should find ways of engaging with informal market operators as allies and looking at ways of improving the supply chain of water through the informal economy. This is a part of a research value chain model, and you can see on the right side of your screen an illustration of some of the steps of the water chain, from water trucks pumping water from the river, water sellers selling water from tanks in their homes, then distribution of water through stevedores, mainly children who cart water, and then finally selling water at the street level. One of the important aspects, as I mentioned, is the high cost of water in the informal economy, and this is a part of our research mapping of water prices across the city. The blue areas are the areas where people have access to piped water, so the water is cheaper, but the orange and red areas illustrate where water is very scarce, and the cost of water goes up to over $10 a cubic meter, or when sold by the bucket, as much as $1 per 20 liter bucket. The household based water sellers are an important link in the delivery chain. Households buy water from the water tankers and store it in underground tanks at their homes, and then sell water to their neighbors, rarely making much profit. In fact, the price of water is very much controlled by the social demand in the neighborhood, because when household water tank owners can't afford a full tank of water from a truck driver, they become consumers. So the relationship between buying water from your neighbor is an important one to maintain solidarity in the neighborhood, to ensure that you have a market for selling when you're able to, but also can afford water to buy water from your neighbors in the case of water scarcity. An important part of the chain are the water carriers, carters, and stevedores. These are normally women and girls, and they account for 85% of the carriers. But the value added, the monetary value added of the water carters is rarely factored into the household cost of water. So women and girls' labor is largely seen as free in the household, but we know as real social costs. Child stevedores sometimes are paid minimal fees to haul water weighing up to 40, 50 kilograms for a distance of several kilometers. So the informal water market in Luanda annually is valued at about $250 million, just the informal, through the informal transactions. The informal delivery through water trucks and is an expensive way of distributing water, and it's very difficult to control the water quality. But the fact that households pay high costs for water is a demonstration of the poor's capacity and willingness to pay for the basic services that they require. There's a potential for incorporating the small-scale water operators in community-based enterprises until that point when the government utilities are able to provide water for the whole of the population in Luanda. Now, the Development Workshop has worked on building on this social capital that we found through research in the communities on building a community water self-management system where community committees are organized to take care and cover maintenance of standposts and recover the costs of fees for services. There's the community management system produces a strong sense of co-ownership of the water infrastructure by communities themselves, and a sense of willingness to pay by consumers. Consumer associations have become strong voices in advocating for the right to water. Consumers have, through their associations, put demands on service providers and local government for improving quantity and performance in the water sector. And part of the program that we developed with communities has been a real-time complaint system for monitoring water supply through standposts, basically, and the participation of local water committees in municipal consultative councils. The municipal councils that are established in all of the municipalities across Luanda, but across the country as well, will be replaced by local elected governments in 2020. And the contribution of water committees who represent consumers will be important to this process of engaging local government and engaging in the municipalization of services in the future. A photograph of the real-time mobile phone system that we've set up together with water committees to put demands on service providers for better performance and services in the water sector. So I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really informative and really helpful. And I really liked the way you talked about being able to sort of engage with the informal sector rather than just pushing them away and say, you know, kind of making them outlawed, but trying to kind of get the government to work together with them. So that was really helpful. Our next presenter is Musatem Fadel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott.
Just want to remind all my presenters to try to keep to your time, about 10 minutes per presentation, so we have enough time left over for questions at the end.
Sure, we'll do my best. Can you hear me, Scott?
I can hear you fine, and PowerPoint looks great.
All right, great. And on my end, I will be talking about socioeconomic burden of water shortages and with implications of climate change, of course. Now, this is a program that is funded by IDRC on climate change and seawater intrusion along the Eastern Mediterranean for the past 4 to 5 years. And conceptually, if you may allow me, the issue of saltwater intrusion starts primarily from increased urbanization and growth in population that leads in urban area to a great extent some urban heat island effect as well. All will cause a land use and cover change in these areas that, when coupled with climate change impacts that are expected or have been actually documented to increase temperature and decrease precipitation, and in coastal areas also with some sea level rise, combined they have increased the water demand. And in urban areas, many authorities are not being able to cope, and people are resorting primarily to increased groundwater abstraction. As a result, you will start seeing an increase in seaward pressure and saltwater intrusion. And that saltwater intrusion is causing quite a bit of burden in addition to the water shortages. Now, of course, when we talk about some case studies, and this is the case of Beirut, the population growth and urbanization in recent years have really reached very high levels, particularly with the wars in neighboring Syria that has caused an influx of people from Syria to a level of nearly a third to almost half the population of the country overall. You can only imagine when you have a city or you have a country of 20 million and all of a sudden you have 6 or 10 million additional people. That on itself is a lot of burden, but irrespective of it, the city had been experiencing really severe chronic public water shortages, sometimes in the dry season reaching a water supply of only 3 hours per day. And people have, of course, resorted to water from unregulated private wells, which caused increased saltwater intrusion. At the same time, to remedy this situation, many households, building level, decentralized RO systems have proliferated, increasing the social cost as well. Now, obviously, in some affluent locations, they can afford these RO systems. However, in many of the parts of the city, the water tankers have really replaced the government almost totally, and that has had severe implications on due to water quality, and of course, not to mention the actual cost of the water. Now, the issue of water tankers is not new, and it's not something that is only particularly in this part of the world, but rather is really worldwide. One would have experienced it. Alan just talked about Luanda, and this is something that you will find it all over the world, for various reasons, of course. Now, in Beirut proper, we have tried to do some comprehensive water sampling and monitoring to follow not only the tankers, but also the households as to what is the quality of the water that people are getting. And for the most, what we have found is that almost over 90% of wells have been affected by salinity. And in some areas, the salinity, particularly in the dry season, exceeded nearly 20,000 parts per million. And when you think about it, this is almost reaching the sea level type water. And the nature of the subsurface being karstic in nature is not helping as well. In addition, many of the wells we have seen microbial loads exceeding by far water quality standards. Now, clearly, altogether, this has given more reason for the proliferation of water tankers and for the delivery of water with a markup price that is nearly 8 to 24 folds that of the public water supply. When we calculated the overall economic burden, we have reached a number that is one really of the highest in the world, 16% of the average household. And that is excluding other externalities associated with poor water quality of tankers, the cost of potential illness and the damage to household appliances, or the purchase of bottled water in many neighborhoods. Now, of course, the private service providers are resorting to obtain water from unprotected sources and to set prices entirely at their discretion, considering factors of supply and demand. And there's obviously a need to regulate these services to ensure compliance primarily with water quality and tariffs. And the laissez-faire attitude of the government has resulted in the proliferation of this business and with no control whatsoever, reaching a high cost, which is totally unjustifiable, considering the poor water quality and that's being delivered and the equivalent economic burden as a function of the average household income. And with this, I would close with that it is imperative to have some kind of a management framework that would recognize and regulate the water vending sector, as well as formalize and control its market to ensure the provision of safe and affordable water services. And that should be done through a monitoring program that continuously assesses the performance of the sector in the context of consumer protection and their complaints. And that is where the role of the water authorities could come in instead of keeping the laissez-faire attitude that they currently maintain. And with this, I thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for that presentation, and I really appreciated that. And I think we can all see how it kind of connects back to what Alan was discussing about the informal water vending and the ways that kind of operates on a local neighborhood scale and on a city scale. I mean, how it makes these different changes between the availability of water. And I think often when people think about water, it's about piped access, but you guys have both highlighted ways that I mean, people have a much more limited access to, and the costs are much higher when you're talking about vended water. So thank you so much for that. Our next presenter comes from Oscar. Hello.
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Great. So let me see if you can see my screen. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you, and it looks fun. Just make that full screen, and there we go. That looks great. Okay,
so let me start by saying that this was a research project done by several co-authors here in the screen. And the idea was to look into new or different tools to try to adapt to climate change effects that we're seeing in the city of Santiago in Chile. And this was funded also by IDRC. And this is part of the project of our Center for Global Change in Santiago at Catholic University. So the issue here is that in the past few years, 10 years or so, I would say, we've been seeing some recent phenomena that we haven't seen in the past. And there's basically two types of phenomena that we're focusing here. And one has to do with short-term effects, where the main river, the Maipo River, that goes through the city and provides most of the water, is seeing very high levels of turbidity. And these events can last a few hours or a couple of days, so they're short-term events. But they could end up, as has happened several times now, with fairly large proportions of the city staying without water. So it has become an important concern, especially areas, with poor population. But there are also some effects in terms of long-term reductions, droughts, stronger droughts that we have seen in Santiago and in other parts of Chile. And so we're looking into a way to address these two types of events. And the way these events have been traditionally addressed is with tools like supply management, like looking for new resources, or demand management, establishing irrigation restrictions, campaigns to reduce water use, or infrastructure improvements like more storage, aqueducts, and also land use planning with development restrictions and things like that. But we see that with climate change, there is high uncertainty in terms of what we can expect of these events, their frequency and their intensity. And also many of these tools have the characteristic of being irreversible. So these are big investments, and once you do them, you can't go back. And since these events might be of low frequency, it's not clear what their return is going to be. So they usually have low return, and sometimes they're built and not used for many years. At the same time, the political cycle usually works with a safety first principle. And that means that it could lead to overinvestment, and this overinvestment in infrastructure, at least in the setting that we have here in Chile, means high prices for consumers. And so we try to look for more flexible and cost-effective strategies. So in particular, we're going to propose these two types of water options for the city of Santiago. So a little background on the city of Santiago. It's important to know that in Chile in general, but in Santiago in particular, we have a regulated private water utility, and 70% of the water in the basin goes to agriculture. So in this map here, we see the city of Santiago, all the agricultural area, and the main river going from the Andes Mountains to the sea, basically. We can also see here in this other map on the left, another study. We identified all the parks, large and small, in the city of Santiago, like an important water user in the city. So we try to have a sense of what is the demand of water and what is the urban demand here in red, and the agricultural demand, which obviously has a peak in summer. And how is that affected by the current availability and temperature and the hydraulics? So this is changing with the projections we currently have for climate change. And we see that there's going to be a reduction in the water flows in the river, but also there's going to be a change in the timing or the seasonality of the water availability. So this change in the seasonality can have some effects important for agriculture, but also it might mean that increased temperature and higher levels for the snow line might bring this high turbidity events more frequently. So we are proposing two types of options to address these two different situations. One is meant for the droughts that can last like months or several seasons. And the type of option we thought here was an option where seasonal water is leased from farmers to the water utility. So basically it's a contract between the water utility and a farmer, that the farmer agrees to give its water to the water utility under certain conditions that I'll mention later. And the other type of option is the one related to the high turbidity events that usually last a few hours, and is really a type of interruptible service contracts where the water utility again offers this type of contracts where it has the options to interrupt the service, not provide water for a few hours or a couple of days. And for that, they would charge a lower price for the water. So what we did is first we started creating this model. So this was some time, it took a while to really develop all this model, where we took into consideration obviously all the agricultural demand, the urban demand, and all the hydrology of the basin. And I won't go much into the details of the model, but it was done with the WIP software. And there we simulated the hydrology of the stream flow, how we can model how the system behaves like that, but also the hydraulics within the city and the main water treatment plants. And also we wanted to understand how the system is drawing from two different reservoirs, El Yeso Reservoir and Laguna Negra, and how, depending on how demand varies and how the supply varies, these two reservoirs need to be used. And particularly this Yeso Reservoir is the one we're going to be using as a trigger for executing the option contract in the case of the farmers. So together with that, we also used climate change scenarios, and we looked into several of them, 15 climate change scenarios for the period 2010 to 2050, and started looking at what were the supply deficits we could expect based on these different scenarios. And here we see that there almost 70% of the scenarios are yielding some type of deficit, and obviously the more dramatic scenarios have larger deficits, which are not very large in terms of the amount of water, but it could mean several days or even weeks without water, and that certainly could be very catastrophic for the city. So going to the results, we use this lease options, going from, again, farmers to the water utility, to show what would happen if a different number of water shares from the market are used to try to cover these deficits. And we see that with a trigger that is about 25% of the capacity of the reservoir, we can only reach close to zero deficit with 2,000 shares, which is almost the same amount of water shares that the water utility has right now. So that would be a really high amount of water options. And this can be seen here also, the amount of actual share that is transfers in the whole period, so in 40 years. And it's a reflection on how much this could potentially cost, how many times these contracts would need to be exercised. And so we also tried another trigger that's half the previous, or double the previous trigger, and that would allow us to reach a 0% of failure with a more moderate amount of shares, but certainly would be using a larger amount of shares in total, so more security at a higher cost. But we basically are showing how this could be implemented and the feasibility of this alternative. So in terms of the other type of contract, of the other option, we looked at the different demands that the parks have for water, and we simulated the interruption of the service to these large consumers. And depending of how many of them we added to the contract, we could see how many minutes of extra operation per event we would have in the city. So this would give us at the most 20 additional minutes, which doesn't sound much, but when we have an interruption that could be a couple of hours, then 20 more minutes is already significant, but it clearly could be expanded to additional users. So to close my presentation, as conclusion, I would say that's interesting to quantify these events, but it's certainly difficult due to the high uncertainty, especially about these short-term events that climate change is bringing. And our proposal of option contracts, we think, can reduce the effects of these extreme events without involving any complex ex-ante decision-making that is usually required for big investments. So this could be a more flexible and more cost-effective alternative, and could be, addressing these issues with much lower costs. And this type of contracts also have a proactive and a reactive adaptation feature, and can be clearly a viable tool for public and private adaptation. So there is a private component here because of the private water utility, and also public because of the water regulation framework. But certainly there's more research that should be done in this area, and some of it we are addressing it like right now, and is getting into the details of the economic benefits and the cost for farmers, and how this would actually be implemented. Is there room for the implementation? Although we already know that some of these water options are already in place. The water utility already apparently has some of these options working. And we are also working on seeing how this interruptible service could be implemented, and thinking of other large urban water consumers. So going to industries, but also potentially start thinking about taking this to individual households and how they would react to this type of contract. And another line of research is understanding how we would need to change the regulatory requirements to allow for this type of contracts to be included within the whole regulatory framework of the water. And also another concern is how will water rights market react to this type of implementation, and how they would accommodate water option contracts. And with that, I'm finishing, so thank you.
Well, thank you for that really great presentation. And as we discussed earlier, it was really interesting to see that kind of quantification data and research, particularly in the context of situations like Cape Town's recent Day Zero scare, to be able to kind of project that into the future of Santiago and be able to kind of play out some scenarios. I thought that was really helpful and really important information, important research needs to be kind of replicated elsewhere just to kind of see how else you can find this. Our next speaker is Dina Shervan. The floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me and see my screen?
We can hear you, but can't quite see you. Screen. There you go. Now we can. Looks great.
Right. So thanks everyone for listening in. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little different from what the other speakers have spoken about, in the sense I'm not actually going to be presenting the results of individual studies of this very large 4-year project, which involved almost 30 researchers over 4 years. But what I really want to do is talk about the philosophical approach we took in this project and why we ended up needing that philosophical approach. As you can see, there were multiple PIs on this project, and I will be presenting on behalf of the rest of our team. Sorry, not going. Oops. Okay. Sorry. So the traditional approach to climate adaptation, when we started this project about 6 years ago now, was we were finding that there was a lot of hydrology type of work which would downscale climate models, apply them to watersheds, and then kind of say what's the impact of that on water supply, water demand, and therefore various livelihood and domestic water security outcomes. And what we found was very early on that this traditional approach wasn't helping us conceive and conceptualize the project very well. And what we basically realized is that we needed to take a multiple concerns, multiple stressors, and multi-level approach, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the first two primarily. Now, what do we mean by multiple concerns? When we started the project, what we found was that a lot of the climate adaptation research was really about climate resilience to climate change, and the focus was on variability. And this made a lot of sense, we thought, in developed country contexts, where countries have already met a lot of their basic water supply needs, and they've reached relative levels of stability. They aren't growing too much. And as a result, the main concern was really how do we maintain those levels of stability in the face of changing climate. Now, what we found was that this approach was very limiting. Sorry, this approach was very limiting in the Indian context, because in a lot of our watersheds, most households still did not have access to basic quantities of water, and we saw that with a lot of the Africa presentations today. And there was also a lot of inequity between households, within towns, and fairness issues between agriculture and urban water. And so focusing narrowly on just climate variability was not sufficient to frame our problem. The second problem was multiple stressors. And what we found very early on was that if you just went out into any one of these Indian cities that are growing so rapidly, it's clearly a problem of everything change, in the sense that everything is changing so fast that if we only changed climate and held everything else constant into the future, we weren't really going to be able to gain a realistic understanding of what that future we're trying to adapt to. And so the only way we could have any sense of adapting to a future with a very different climate was to have positions on what was going to happen with all kinds of other socioeconomic stressors. And that was really, really challenging, because everything was changing so rapidly that it was very clear that if we had been sitting here 30 years ago, we could not have imagined what could have happened to the city 30 years later. And so it became very clear very early on that we needed to have a much more complex and holistic way of looking at the entire system. And so this was the framework we used. We kind of started off with the external drivers of population growth, urbanization, technological change. And we realized was that those were changing land, labor, and commodity markets, which were in turn changing land use decisions of various users. The land use in turn was mediating how climate, both global and local climate, were actually changing water availability in dams, reservoirs, and tanks and groundwater. And the water availability at the watershed level was being mediated through institutions as well as the physical infrastructure in terms of how they were being delivered to users. And then the users were generating wastewater and abstracting water resources directly. And all of this was finally resulting in what we call multiple concerns, which is adequacy, quality, biodiversity, sustainability, justice, and so on, the things that we might actually care about. Now, our two study sites were both located in the Kaveri Basin in South India. And what we found was we conducted our research around two large cities, the city of Bangalore, which is in the Arkavati Basin, the Arkavati watershed of the Kaveri Basin, and the city of Coimbatore, which was in the Noyal sub-basin of the Kaveri Basin. Now I'm going to just quickly walk you through what we meant and what we found with those multiple concerns. So like I said, the multiple concerns that we were looking at were adequacy, equity, and fairness across user groups as well as between sectors, long-term sustainability of the resource, and public health. Now, what we found, this was from some results from our Coimbatore or the Noyal Basin study, and where we looked at urban water supply across multiple small towns. And what we found was, firstly, that all of these towns were depending on a blend of surface and groundwater. So they were getting what they call imported river water, which was being coming from large projects, and then they were augmenting the water with local self-supplied groundwater, and they were doing so to different extents because of differences in groundwater availability, because of differences in infrastructural capacity, and so on. And as a result of this, if we compare how each town was faring with respect to the norms, there was a wide variety where some of the towns were not meeting the minimum norm that the state was prescribing for a town of that size, while others were some were exceeding, while others were far below the norm. And so there was a huge variability in just the adequacy based on a combination of resource availability as well as institutional capacity of the different towns. Then in terms of sustainability, what became very, very clear is basically groundwater was disappearing because as a lot of, and this was particularly farmers, were not getting access to surface water, and as wealth increased in this area, the farmers had access to more capital to drill deeper. And what we were finding is that the depth of ground, the wells drilled by farmers were increasing rapidly. And in fact, but not only was the depth of the wells increasing, the number of bore wells drilled was also continuously increasing. So there was no feedback mechanism that was actually stopping farmers from stopping to drill once the groundwater began to decline because of, and this was entirely driven by the fact that urbanization was driving incomes, which was allowing farmers to drill deeper, but also sell higher and higher value crops to an increasingly wealthy population. What we saw in terms of public health was some of our studies in downstream, and what we found was as industrialization was happening, there was massive releases of heavy metals into the water system, and most of these heavy metal releases were actually there were spikes happening during the nighttime hours when and the Pollution Control Board was actually not detecting any of these spikes because they were not doing continuous monitoring. They were in fact only doing grab samples during the daytime hours. And so one of our major results was urbanization was causing a spike in industrial pollution. And as I'll show you later when we put the whole story together, that was actually making its way back into the food chain. The second set of arguments that I wanted to show you was our arguments about multiple stressors. So very, very early on, we found that the climate models were showing that rainfall, and climate models across the board were showing that increases in rainfall in peninsular India in all cases. But what we actually found in terms of stream flow was a 90% decline in stream flow. So the first thing that we did was to check whether we could explain that 90% decline in stream flow through changes in temperature or changes in precipitation. And what we found was this massive decline in stream flow, but there was actually no statistically significant change in either average annual precipitation or extreme events, actually. And there was actually no statistically significant decline in potential evapotranspiration once we accounted for changes in cloudiness. Temperature did increase, but we could not find a statistically significant increase in potential evapotranspiration. So that basically led us to think about what was basically driving this 90% decline in stream flow. And very early on, it became clear that groundwater was declining, and there was in fact a very sharp decline in base flow. And we did one very simple analysis, which was we counted how many months in a given year there was inflow into the reservoir when there was no rain. So that would be explained by base flow. And we found shockingly after 1992, there was not a single year in which there was inflow into the reservoir when there was no rain. So this showed very, very steep declines. So this suggested basically that we couldn't be looking, if we wanted to look in the future, we couldn't be looking only at climate change. We needed really to be looking at anthropogenic stressors and specifically anthropogenic modifications of these watersheds, both in terms of what groundwater pumping was doing, but eventually we looked at watershed development, a whole bunch of eucalyptus plantations, a whole variety of different stressors were together causing these massive declines in stream flow. Now, what we did then was to put that entire story together, and I'm only going to show you the conceptual model, although we have put these together as mathematical models as well. But what we basically found is that there was a very different story upstream of these watersheds and downstream of these watersheds, and they were actually consistent across both watersheds. So this kind of helped us develop a general template of how urbanization and climate change juxtapose to create all kinds of impacts on human well-being. So firstly, we found that urbanization was increasing labor demand, not surprisingly, and that was causing farmers to invest in eucalyptus plantations because they could then just put their land under eucalyptus and go and work in the city. This was causing a decrease in groundwater recharge. At the same time, urbanization was driving a demand for high-value crops, which was driving investments in bore wells and also decreasing groundwater. Technology was, of course, making bore well drilling cheaper. At the same time, the political economy had a groundwater governance system which actually placed no controls on groundwater, and electricity was actually free for farmers and remains free for farmers. And to fix this groundwater governance issue, the government was basically heavily investing in watershed development processes, but those were actually, they were increasing recharge a little bit, but they were actually causing declines in downstream flow into the reservoir. And as a result of this, what we were finding is, ironically, urbanization was basically driving a depletion of ground and surface water and actually causing negative impacts on equity, sustainability, and resilience. But as I said, this was caused by the combined effects of climate change and climate variability and technology and urbanization put together. Downstream, the story was very different. Urbanization and industrialization, which goes with it, were resulting in heavy metal pollution, which were not being enforced through the current pollution laws. And these were resulting in product contamination as well as direct exposure of farmers, and ultimately impacting both producer and consumer health. So, and population growth at the same time, the infrastructure was not keeping up. It was causing biological contamination, again, resulting in deleterious effects on farmer and consumer health. So the long and short of the story is that we were able to put together, through the framework that we used, a fairly complex web of effects that urbanization and climate change together were going to have on a whole range of human well-being outcomes. And that's why we call this the multiple concern, multiple stress, or multi-level approach. Thank you so much, and I just wanted to acknowledge the very large team that was involved in this research.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and it's great to see such a large team. I mean, so often we all know that you know, you talk to one PI, but that PI is part of a gross big team that has a lot of people on it, and it's an effort to make this kind of research happen. And it's good to you to recognize all that. And I appreciate that presentation. That really brought a combination of sort of the qualitative and the quantitative research together, I felt like, and gave us interesting observations that really helpful. Just to remind all of our people who are watching in the audience, we will have time for questions at the end, though quite not as much time as we would like. And you can ask the questions on the GoToWebinar control panel. About halfway down, it says questions. If you go ahead and type that in, I'll see the questions and can direct them to the appropriate panelist. Try to keep your questions not overly specific, you know, not I have a question for so-and-so about slide number 5. If you do, that's great. And go ahead and reach out to that panelist directly. They're all very friendly, trust me. So just go ahead and ask about that, you know, rather than taking everyone's time. Let's try to find questions that are applicable and interesting to everybody. So our final panelist is Kamal Bata. And the floor is yours, sir.
So, good evening, everybody. I would like to speak on the work we have done on assessing the economic impact of low-cost water-saving irrigation technology in Indian Punjab, which is the tensiometer. This is a part of the bigger project which was funded by IDRC, to Centers for International Projects Trust, which is India Office of Columbia Water Center, then Columbia Water Center at Columbia University of New York, and the Punjab Agriculture University together. If you look into the traditional green revolution belt, where the productivity increased substantially since the middle of the 1960s, we find that there is an access to irrigation water, and that led to a substantial increase in food production. But it led to an excessive dependence on groundwater as well, and leading to the overexploitation over a period of time. And there were various economic and non-economic factors which led to the shift in cropping pattern towards the water-intensive crops like rice in these areas. So there were policy-related factors, and there were economy-related factors, and there was a lot of reduction in terms of production and marketing risk. So this actually led to affecting the overdependence in groundwater. It affected the traditional green revolution belt, which consisted of Gujarat, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh, which can be termed as the entire food bowl of India. I would like to say something about the state of India and Punjab, where we worked under the project. This is a highly intensive agricultural state. If you look at India, on an average, one crop is taken in a year, and compared to that, two or more crops are taken in a year in the state. And we can see that the fertilizer use, it is one of the highest at 460 kg per hectare, and with just only 3% of the total area under agriculture, the state produces around 12% of the national food grains, and it contributes more than 25% of wheat and 41% of paddy to the national food for the food security initiative. But over time, there has been an excessive increase in the dependence on groundwater, which can be observed from the number of borewells, which are 1.4 million at current point of time. So we have 1 million holdings, and there are 1.4 million tube wells in the state. So it can show very high over-dependence on the groundwater. And the recent times, as a result, the average water table fall has been almost 1 meter per annum. And out of the 132 development blocks in the state, almost 110 are overexploited, means they are extracting more water than the sustainable level of supply. And the governments now are exploring the institutional and technological solutions without any adverse impact on the farm incomes. And there have been some laws, like Punjab Preservation of Soil Water Act in 2009, which prohibits the early transplantation of rice crop, which is the most water-consuming crop. And it prohibits that the rice should not be transplanted before 20th of June, which was not there earlier. And this act actually substantially showed an improvement in the water table level. And then the government is promoting the labor land through the agri-machinery service center, which are the farmers' cooperatives, to promote the precision farming. So the study actually was undertaken to evaluate the technical feasibility of tensiometer in terms of water and energy saving, and associated with economic benefits of this technology. So if you can see on the right side, this is model rice, it is a low-cost modified version, which was developed by Punjab Agricultural University, and the cost of a unit is around $6 to $7. So this is low-cost technology. We found that it was quite ready to be adopted by the farmers, and we started promoting this technology earlier in 2010. It was done by Centers for International Project Research, Punjab Agricultural University, and Columbia Water Center together. And you can see the number of farmers visited. We covered, over the period of 5 years, we covered around 14,000 farmers, and we reached around 136 villages in 2014, and we were operational in 8 out of 22 districts of the state, and we were focusing on the area which was being, overexploited, and which was observing the highest fall in the groundwater table. I think we have this data is till 2014, but by now we have reached around 42,000 farmers to promote this technology. So how we promote this technology is that we go to the field 1 month before the start of the transplantation of rice, and we generate awareness among the farmers through farmers camps, and then partnering with the farmers cooperatives. And then after inserting this tensiometer in the farmer field, the field investigators regularly visit each and every farmer in an interval of 2 weeks to see the operation of the technology and also recording the data. So regarding the benefits, we use the data from around 7,800 farmers, and we found that the technology has potential to deliver on the of irrigation water and about 90% in the labor using agriculture. And it reduction in the overall cost of cultivation. And there is no negative effect on the productivity. So the technology fits well into the economics of the farmers because it doesn't affect their productivity adversely, but it helps in reducing the irrigation water and electricity. We aggregated all these benefits, use the economic approach, and we estimated the benefits over a period of 2010 to 2025. And we estimated that the adoption of this technology over an area of around 30% of paddy over a period of time, it will help in reducing the irrigation water savings by 167 million hectare meter and electricity saving of around 1,516 million units. And as a result, the state has a problem of providing free subsidy, power subsidy to the farmers. No money is charged for the farmers. So this is a vicious cycle actually, which is leading to more and more consumption of water and then decline the water table, and at the same time, again, more and more consumption of electricity and then power subsidy. So the technology has the potential to reduce the power subsidy by an amount of $459 million. And then we did some sensitivity analysis by assuming that the cost, which is currently estimated at around 7% reduction, we assume that over a longer period of time, the adoption of water saving technology will also help in reducing the input use at those farms, and we assume that the cost reduction will go as high as 10%. And at this assumption, we estimated that electricity saving will be more than 2,000 million units, and the power subsidy reduction will be at around $670 million. We did the integrations, and we estimated that the age and education are significant factors for the adoption of the tensiometer or the soil moisture sensor technology. A 10% increase in the education could increase the probability of adoption and use of the tensiometer by 0.6%. And we also found that there was a high probability at the labor land level fields. The farmers who were having labor land level fields, they were more likely to adopt technology. So the probability of adoption increased by around 0.3% with 10% increase in the area under precision leveling. So we concluded that technological solutions such as tensiometer or moisture sensors in rice are significant potential to save irrigation water and electricity in agriculture, and there is a need to shift away from power subsidy and invest in such kind of technology. We just recently we are working on a report on water, energy, and agriculture nexus. We have shown to the government that a substantial shift from subsidies to investment in research and development of new technologies can save a substantial amount of subsidies over a longer period of time. We developed a scenario, and we highlighted this to the government as well. And luckily, the government is looking into this and trying to experiment on a way how the shifts can happen. And recommend a lot of potential to generate awareness among the farmers regarding the conservation of water resources and the adoption of precision water saving technologies, and then lead to build the capacity of these farmers in terms of using those technologies. ROCs. Targeting the younger and more educated farmers in the beginning is going to help. And at last, I show some photographs actually where we highlight that there is need to move towards the digital solutions for such kind of water saving technology. CIPD is currently involved in developing the low-cost digital soil moisture sensors. So we started from this sensor meter. We got some total sensors from abroad, and then by partnering with local organizations in India, we have been able to bring the cost of these digital soil moisture sensors by a factor of 10. So from one piece at a US dollar of 150, we have been able to bring the cost down to around $10 a piece or $15 a piece. And currently we are testing this sensor in another area which was originally not part of the IDRC project, but we are now moving into the eastern India. We are working on the sustainable village idea, and we are pushing the farmers to take another crop by conserving the water resources and using the water resources efficiently. So this last photograph is actually showing how the farmer is trying to use the sensor to use this in irrigation of the vegetable crops. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was a really great presentation, and it was hard to entirely make out everything with the connection being quite so bad, but we appreciate that research, and what I really enjoyed was being able to find such kind of a new technology and being able to get that kind of research out so quickly and test its applicability and how it can really be helpful to addressing these issues. And just to remind everyone, we are going to have a few questions, a little bit of time for questions as we kind of get towards the end here. And you can just ask those in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. It's right about halfway down. The first question we have is, there we go. You know, could maybe people discuss, I mean, this is a kind of a question primarily for Alan, but anyone can jump in and discuss, you know, the relationship they found in their research between urban and rural informal markets. I mean, do they operate differently, or how do they change between the two different sectors? So Alan, maybe you want to start, and then anyone else who has some kind of other research that, you know, ideas and thoughts that their research has brought up can jump in afterwards.
Yes, clearly, the urban water market for consumers, for household consumers, is much more extensive. The rural informal economy is an important employer of and makes an important contribution to the Angolan economy. But it's largely around another study that we're doing right now, connected with biomass and charcoal and these kinds of productions of local energy sources that dominate the informal rural economy. But the water markets are very much an urban phenomenon.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that feedback. I know we have a question directed for Dina, but Dina had to leave a little early, so you can, Elizabeth, you ask a question there for Dina, and if you can follow up with her directly, that'd be great. You know, another question is maybe kind of also comparing some different sectors, but and this is a question more for Oscar, but in Santiago, you know, could you, how are the differences you see economically or otherwise for cutting off water service between commercial and industrial users? And again, anyone else who has some thoughts, between different types of water users, agricultural and urban, or any others, please jump in afterwards.
Yeah, between commercial and industrial, I would say, at least in Santiago, one of the big differences, I would say, is that most of the commercial is part of the grid. So they're connected to the network, and they pay, you know, maybe they have a different tariff that households, but they're part of the network. Whereas industrial, you have a mix. So depending on the size of your industry, of your operation, you might have your own water source. So you can have underground water, and that means that you only buy underwater right to access that water. And you might buy services from the water utility in terms of sanitation. And they will charge sanitation based on how much water you're getting from the underground water. So it's a little bit different, the two types of schemes, depending on if you're connected or not to the network. And industrial activities usually have their own water sources. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Does anyone else have some feedback about cross-sectorial? Another question that's come up here is maybe kind of discuss for different studies. Are you seeing any population migration changes as a result of climate change? Are you seeing any of that in your case study areas?
I could maybe mention that the conflict years in Angola produced a massive migration to the coastal areas, and from the parts of the country in the interior where the civil war was very hot. But this migration forced populations into the coastal strip of the country where serious climate change impacts are noted. I mean, these are areas that of flooding, mangrove swamp areas, and areas that traditionally didn't support large populations, but the security in the country forced people into these high-risk areas. And people in the post-war period continue living in land that they acquired, normally purchased at fairly high prices. So we find that while the climate change factors are increasing stress on these particular areas, people have bought into urban markets, livelihoods, survival of families. It depends on the urban economy now, and people are really having to find ways of adaptation of their communities, of their settlements, in order to deal with climate change. Building resilience is an important part of the decentralized program of the government now, building through participatory planning and resilient strategies are very important at this point in Angola.
Okay. Did anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Well, in a very different perspective, it's really hard to attribute to climate change migration that we are seeing right now in Chile, but it's clearly a relevant phenomenon nowadays. We've seen in the past years an important increase in the inflows from migrants from nearby countries and also from other countries like Haiti and Colombia. And this apparently is disproportionately coming to big cities like Santiago. So it's changing the population dynamics, and therefore it's changing water demand too. So although it's not clearly related to climate change, the migration, it does have implications for our climate change adaptation strategies.
Yeah, I would add the same thing also, Scott. that the migration is not necessarily due to climate change. In our case, it's primarily for conflicts. There's a lot of migration inwards towards Lebanon, as I mentioned in my presentation. But as also was just mentioned, is that it has quite a bit of implications on adaptation strategies, particularly in terms of overall water demand in various sectors.
Great. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Well, I think this is about the end of our webinar. We've gone about the whole time. I'd like to give all my panelists one last chance to, weigh in on some reflections or thoughts, cross-cutting ideas that maybe have come up. So I'll just go right down the list here. Alan, would you like to go first?
I would just like to take note that in Angola, in this post-conflict period, the decentralization of decision-making to more participatory levels of local government are important for water governance, adaptations to climate change that can be influenced by local communities. And I think this is partly a political process, as well as building resistance to climate change has become part of the political strategy.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Charlotte, did you have anything to add?
Hi, Scott. Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation that what really came out, even though I know it very well,
Get a little closer to your microphone there, Charlotte. Can't quite hear you.
I'm just noting that the challenges for water supply and demand, particularly the urban demand, were very similar between all of the regions that we've had presentations from. The same drivers and many of the common problems, but with very different solutions. And I think the question of informal markets is very interesting, and I think that it definitely should be a lot more focus on this in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Kamal?
Yeah. You see, in our work, what we find is that in a policy environment where everything is, the power is free, actually there is no incentive for the farmers to use the technologies to save water, because there is no marginal pricing over there. So I think after the end of the project, we really found it very important to inform the policymakers, and we worked on this nexus modeling. And by developing the scenarios, I think just in last 2 or 3 months, there is a change in the government, and we see the proactiveness of the government to look into various options to shift from subsidies to development and promotion of these kind of technologies. So this is happening very slowly. But I think now there's a plan going on with the government that they are going to shift some amount of money to promote such kind of technology. So I think this is an achievement which comes late in the project, but comes nice.
Okay, thank you. Musatem?
Yes, I just want to share one thought with the audience and the panel, and that is we keep on talking too much about climate change, which is obviously evident. The question is that from the water resources perspective, is that population growth and development, and at times perhaps urbanization, but mainly population growth and development, I would say, are really outpacing the impact of climate change today. The additionality factor of climate change is a challenge sometimes to define with this impact of development and population growth, particularly in most of the developing world. We see that the overall demand associated with population growth is far more than what we're expecting in the climate change, its impact itself. Now, clearly, we always talk about adaptation strategies in terms of a win-win situation anyway, but still something has to be done more at the level also of population growth in addition to what we're doing to climate change adaptation.
That's a good observation. That's a good thing to bring back and remind ourselves of. That it's not just all about climate change. It's not just about one thing, but there's a lot of different intersecting aspects, particularly population. And our last speaker, Oscar.
Yeah, I think I agree with much of what was said, but I would add the need to work with multidisciplinary teams. As we see, it's not only climate change, so it's migration, it's development, it's policy, so there are many things. And really, this highlights how this problem is really a complex problem, and you cannot have only one narrow view to try to solve the real issues. And I think this is a real call to do multidisciplinary research and test solutions and propose innovative alternatives to what's been done already.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that a lot of the presentations here today really both themselves were interdisciplinary, and as well, bringing them all together in a special issue like this kind of highlights the interdisciplinary approach that needs to be brought here today. I really appreciate everyone, all my panelists. Thank you so much for all your help. Charlotte McAllister at the International Development Research Center for really helping bring this together. Charlotte, a lot of thank you for that. As well as Alan Kane at the Development Workshop in Angola. Mustam Fadel at the American University of Beirut, Oscar Mello at Pontifical Universidad Católica in Chile, Vina Servan at Asoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, and Kamel Bhatta at the Columbia Water Center in India. I know some of my panelists and IWRA itself are on Twitter, so if you want to, go ahead and look us all up and follow us on Twitter and various social media. Again, if the presentations spark some interest, you want to have a debate, a discussion, or you have some other points you want to follow up on, you can go to our LinkedIn page and continue the discussion on there. We'll have a post up very soon about this webinar, so you can follow it there. Just remind everyone that we'll have the presentations in PDF format, as well as a recording of this webinar posted to our webpage, IWRA.org, pretty soon, as well be on our YouTube channel. And I really hope that everyone here in the audience today found the insights provided by our panel around this special issue of Water International just as fascinating as I did. And if you really enjoyed the articles, or if you want to learn more, go to Water International online, and the entire special issue is open access, so please download the articles, cite them a lot. And it's going to give us all a lot of material to kind of incorporate into our work, whether or not that's practitioner-based, or whether or not that's academic-based, or whether or not that's in a corporation in a larger society. I think it's all going to give us a lot of creativity and some ideas about how we can sort of tackle these water climate issues that we've been discussing in an interdisciplinary fashion, and across a wide geography, as our panelists really brought together today. So thank you for all joining us today. Just to remind everyone, the webinar was brought to you by International Water Resources Association. We're over 40-year-old nonprofit, non-governmental educational organization. We focus on bridging disciplines and geographies and connecting professionals, students, individuals, corporations, institutions, everyone who's concerned around the sustainable use of the world's water resources. And if you want to know more about the association, or if you want to become a member, you can go to www.iwra.org. So on behalf of the whole IWRA office, thank you for tuning in and watching the webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.